Harry, we've been talking about the ways in which our author wants to suggest that Jesus is foreshadowed by texts and people in the Old Testament, but surpasses the very texts and people who foreshadow him. And now we come to a theme we've briefly mentioned before, but now it's not Moses or Joshua, it's the high priest. Why is Jesus high priest, and what does that relate to in the Old Testament?
Mm-hmm. It relates to the thing we talked about at the end of our first session, the reference to a sacrifice of atonement for sins.
Mm-hmm.
And if the death of Christ is understood as somehow a sacrificial act, and lots of early Christians thought it was,
mm-hmm.
then that generates the notion that you have to have a priest that will perform this sacrificial act. And according to the stipulations of the Old Testament, Jesus was not eligible to be a priest.
Right, because?
Because he was a member of the tribe of Judah,
Yeah,
supposedly, and had to be a member of the tribe of Levi,
right.
as we'll hear when we come to
Right,
chapter 7.
Right.
So, but this is where the author wants to go. He wants to talk about the death of Christ as somehow life transforming for all of us.
Yeah.
And talk about it in terms of imagery derived from the biblical texts on priesthood, and
mm-hmm.
Especially the high priest. So he has to eventually explain how
mm-hmm.
Christ could be a priest.
Mm-hmm.
But he's throwing out little suggestions and
yeah.
teases, if you will,
yeah.
before he gets there. And that's what we have here in chapter 4, verses 14 and 15 and 16. He says, we have a great high priest, picking up the thing that he had thrown out at the end of chapter 2.
Right.
And he adds to it now a little bit. Jesus, the Son of God, we've heard about that
yeah.
before. His addition comes in 15. We don't have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. You could say that that's probably picking up a little bit on the humanity of Jesus
mm-hmm.
that was portrayed in chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
But he expands on that a little bit. We have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. Remember, he wants to give encouragement to a community that's undergoing some sort of stress.
That's very good.
They are being tested.
Yeah.
And so one of the things he wants to say is that this high priest has been there already.
Yeah, that's very good.
And he
Very
can
good.
understand us.
Still a homiletical good device.
Yeah,
right. I know you're having a hard time, but Jesus had a hard time, and he made it.
Yep.
All right.
And he also sets up the image here of Jesus enthroned on high as someone who can intercede for us with God.
Yeah.
And so prayer is going to be important. And he's going to come back to prayer at the very end and talk about the way in which we can follow in the footsteps of Jesus by praying,
mm-hmm.
too. So he's picking up some of these threads, and he's going to be developing them further. And he just announces them here. But he has some other business first. He has to explain a little bit about priesthood. Okay?
All right.
And he does that in chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. And the first verses talk about priests in general.
Mm-hmm.
A priest is someone who performs sacrificial ritual gifts and sacrifices for sins. This is a kind of focused summary of what priests do.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we had a scholar of Israelite priesthood here, we might have
to expand that a bit.
Have to expand that a bit, but it catches an important part.
Yeah. Well, and I think just to go back to what we said at the beginning, reminds us that he's not so much doing a sociology of early Israelite religion. He's talking about what the texts tell him, right? Mm-hmm. He's relying on the story the same way we do.
Right. And one of the elements of the story that he's relying on here is the installation of the first high priest, Moses' brother Aaron.
Yeah.
And one point that he makes is that you don't presume to take on responsibilities like this on your own. You have to be called to it. That's what he says in verse 4. And what he's thinking about is the call of Aaron in Exodus.
Yeah.
And so if he's going to have Christ be a high priest, he has to have a call too.
Absolutely.
And so the folk in the audience are probably folding their arms and saying, okay, show me.
So where is that call?
Where is he called to be a high priest? And this is where Psalm 110:4 comes in.
Comes in blessedly, yes.
And so he does this in chapter 5, verses 5 and 6.
Yeah.
First of all, calls on Psalm 2, the psalm that he had started the Catena with, which reminds us of Psalm 110, which says something similar. So you can see the interesting play on different scriptural texts. And then here's where he throws in Psalm 110:4 in chapter 5, verse 6. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So construing the psalm as an address by God to his son, you have the psalm then saying that the addressee is a priest.
And appointed a priest.
Appointed
right
a
here
priest,
and there.
right.
Right here and now.
Of course, there's nothing like solutions to create problems.
Right.
And so the problem here is, what is it to be a priest according to the order of Melchizedek?
Absolutely.
And so you can see the folk in the audience saying, all right, I follow the logic here, and all right, that psalm is addressed to Christ, so okay, he's a priest, but what in the world is Melchizedek?
Yeah, absolutely.
Another tease, because our homilist isn't going to answer that question for another chapter.
Yeah, absolutely.
He diverts here a little bit and goes back to Jesus in his humanity. In verses 7 through 10, talks about Jesus at prayer with loud cries and supplications, asking God to save him from death. Sounds a little bit like Gethsemane.
Well, I was going to ask you, do you think that our author knows that story? Do you think there's a more general sense of what it is to be a sympathetic priest, or what?
Yeah, if he knows the story, he's tweaking it.
Yeah.
Because he says Jesus was heard because of his reverent submission. And the Gethsemane story
hearing,
is heard only in the resurrection. Maybe that's what he's doing. He might be interpreting the story that way. Maybe he has another tradition about Jesus at prayer.
Right. Well, I just think in general it's helpful to me to remember that often early Christian writers had traditions that we don't have in our text. They didn't sit there with the four Gospels and think that's all they had. They didn't have those at some points, and that wasn't all they had even then.
Yeah, that's true. And another element here is the ideal of someone who prays fervently, which we see in Judaism of the time. And if you have a notion that Jesus is a perfect exemplar of faith, then he's going to pray fervently. So
very good.
That might be just read into his life here. In any case, there's another thing that goes on, is the way in which our author gestures toward things in the more general Greco-Roman world. And his line in verse 8, although he was the Son, Jesus, he learned obedience through what he suffered. There's a famous line out of Aeschylus, pathe mathos, learning comes from suffering, or learning by suffering, and an old Greek proverb in effect. And I think the author here is gesturing toward that. At the same time, he's gesturing toward Jewish ideals of prayer. He's really calling on lots of cultural things.
Okay, I know this is tricky and it's entirely out of left field, but in some traditional Christologies, it would be troublesome to say he was made perfect through his suffering because he was perfect from the beginning of time. Is he was worried about that at all, or is he just on a kind of roll about the importance of suffering and learning?
He's certainly doing the latter. But it's worth thinking about this notion of perfection that we get in Hebrews, because we tend to hear it in terms of moral perfection or whatever. And I don't think that's what our author is talking about. Perfection functions in some ways in Hebrews rather like justification does in Paul. It's sort of, in most cases, the starting point of a process that leads to sanctification and ultimate salvation. Another way of thinking about perfection in Hebrews is qualification for office. So he's perfected in the sense of having gone through whatever course he needs to be high priest. And the kind of high priest that he's just described here is someone who is sympathetic, someone who understands people who are in dire situations, and he's showing us that Christ is that kind of person.
And the training was the suffering.
Training was the suffering.
That's very good. Okay.
Later on, the author will talk about us being perfected, too. And so we'll need to think a little bit more about that.
All right. Well, then as we move ahead, we return once again to the audience, to the hearers, and the fear that they're going to fall away. What do you think falling away means, that giving up on the confession for this congregation? Is this apostasy? Is this staying home from church 3 Sundays out of 4? What's going on?
Right. So before we get to that falling away, we have just a little bit of a gesture to the audience. The author says that he has something that's really hard to explain, especially to you guys. So this is kind of an ironic captatio benevolentiae, getting the goodwill of the audience. He's really saying,
I know this is tough.
This is tough.
Only people as wise as you would have a chance to get there.
And I'm not sure you're there yet.
Right.
Okay, so that's what he says.
A word to me, I believe.
So then he gives the warning in chapter 6. And we have some other early Christian texts that talk about an extreme case of sin, the sin against the Holy Spirit, for instance, in the sayings of Jesus.
Unforgivable.
The unforgivable sin. And I think our author is referring to something like this, sort of a limit case. This kind of goes against the grain of total forgiveness for all time of all sins. And I think at the end of the day, that's where our author might be, because right here he gives us this warning that's balanced with an affirmation that the warning doesn't really obtain for you guys. So there's a limiting case out there. If you refuse, if you refuse to accept the grace that's given to you in the Christ event, there's no hope for you. But that's not going to happen.
I don't know 6 of you who have now been apostate, and I'm going to pin you. I'm going to say, here's the limiting case.
So
I like that.
There's kind of a theoretical limit the author throws out here.
This is just another quick aside, but I've often thought Judas works that way in the Gospels. That the quest for the historical Judas isn't all that helpful because he's the limiting case. Don't go this far, faithful first-century Christians. This is.
I think that's probably right.
Okay.
And balanced with Judas is also Peter.
Exactly.
So the author throws out this warning. There were some Christians, of course, who did take this position and took it seriously. That is, that there wasn't any hope for repentance after baptism. It was a big controversy in the 2nd century, and eventually the penitential system that we know in the church developed. But some Christians really took this kind of warning very seriously. So after expressing confidence, then the author does also want to give a little message of hope and assurance about the certainty of God's promise. So he does that in chapter 6, verse 13, and he goes back to Genesis again.
And Abraham.
And, the story of the promise to Abraham, I will bless and multiply you, from Genesis 12, one of the first things that God says to Abraham. And Paul calls on this too.
Hugely.
In Romans and Galatians as part of his retelling of the Abraham story. And then what he does is to refer to the fact that God swore an oath.
Which seems odd for God. By myself I swear.
That's right. That's right. These biblical texts that refer to God swearing cause difficulty for other biblical interpreters like Philo. And that Jewish philosopher that we were talking about before. And the answer is the same in all cases. God does it to assure us. God doesn't need to swear. But in order that we might have total confidence in his word, he does it. And that's what our author says here. And he gives us this beautiful image to conclude the whole business, which again is very much a hopeful image, the image of the anchor. Jesus is the anchor of the soul, who is a curious kind of anchor, who is penetrated in behind the veil.
It is a curious kind of anchor,
We have a mixture of metaphors.
That's what we call the mixed metaphor par excellence,
but it's also introducing us to one of the main things that's going to happen in the next several chapters as he compares Jesus to the high priest who goes behind the veil in the temple. And he reminds us then at the end of chapter 6 what the whole tease was about. Jesus is a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And people now are on the edge of their seats. What does that mean?
Please let us know. Okay, that's very helpful. And as a sailor, I know you love that anchor thing.
Indeed.